Go.
Hi, this is Writer Mother Monster, and I am your host, Laura Ehrlich. Our guest today is Mireya Vela. Before I introduce Mireya, thank you all for tuning in. Please chat with us during the interview, and your comments will appear in our broadcast studio. We'll weave them into our conversation. And as always, if you enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a patron or patroness to help keep the podcast going. It is a one-woman show at the moment, and all support is very much appreciated. Now I'm excited to introduce Mireya. Mireya Vela is a Mexican-American creative nonfiction writer, storyteller, and artist in Los Angeles. Vestiges of Courage is her work of collected essays. In her work, Mireya addresses the needs of immigrant Mexican families and the disparities they face every day. She tackles issues of inequity and how ingrained societal systems support the ongoing injustice that contributes to continuing poverty and abuse. Her work has been published in Hippocampus Magazine, Noble Gas Quarterly, Not Your Mother's Breastmilk, Miracle Monocle, Blanket Sea, and Collective Unrest, and she's also a visual artist. She lives, again, in LA and has 2 children, a 27-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. She describes writer motherhood in 3 words as OMG, WTF, LMAO. Thank you and welcome, Mireya. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. It's hot in LA. Is it hot where you are?
You know, it is not. I am on the opposite coast in Connecticut, and it's just kind of drizzly. It's not cold, but it's not very nice out.
Very cool.
Yeah, but I'm so glad that you could join me today. I've been a Facebook follower and friend of yours for a long time, so I've enjoyed your posts and your artwork and your stories, and of course your writing. So it's a pleasure to meet you at last.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Now let's jump right in with your 3 words. OMG, WTF, LMAO, which actually I'm not sure, and maybe you guys can vote on this, whether that counts as 3 words since they're acronyms, or if it counts as a whole bunch of words disguised as 3 words. But tell us about your choice there.
You might have a point there. I don't think you could use those in Scrabble, right?
That might be a determining factor. I don't know. We'll have to research that.
Yeah. So I have 2 kids, and I have my son who's 27, and so I was a parent to him for a very long time exclusively, and that's where a lot of the OMG comes from. And then and my daughter, who is a really wonderful and lovely person, but man, does that girl have a mouth. So especially with my son, I had a lot of WTF moments. So both of my kids are on the spectrum. My daughter was recently diagnosed, and they both have ADHD. It wasn't, with my son, it was really hard to see it because he had so many different issues that were governing his education or really affecting his learning and the way that he socialized. But with my daughter, they're very clearly like these 2 different things. It's a lot clearer to see with her. And the conversations that we have in this house, because I'm also neurodivergent, I have ADHD, my husband is neurodivergent. So the conversations that we have in this house are hectic. We interrupt each other. They're hilarious. Because one of the things with ADHD, of course, is that you have a faulty filter. And so the things that come out of people's mouths is always interesting and very honest.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've had your hands full for 27 years.
Yes. And definitely parenting my son was very, very different from parenting my daughter. My son started dating. he was really impacted by the different aspects of his autism, and he was part of that, like, really the first really large wave of kids that were diagnosed, and so there wasn't a lot of resources available to help support him. And for that reason, I really struggled to get him help. And it wasn't till he was about 11 or so that somebody said, hey, maybe you should think about autism. And of course, I was like, oh my God, you're okay. And then I went and did it. And it was a really long process, and a very difficult process. I'm sure the process has changed from then, but it was a very, very long process. And then even after we had all of the professionals together to be able to diagnose him, they still argued about whether or not it was actually autism, because he also has a learning disability. So my experience with him, and the fact that he was incredibly socially isolated. So for him, it really affected him socially. For my daughter, that has not been the case, but for my son, it was. And he was really socially isolated until he was about 14. He got along great with family, but didn't have a lot of friends. And then all of a sudden, when he became 14, he started dating. And it was a mess. It was a wild, wild ride.
Yeah. Well, so I respect your son's privacy and asking for more detail around that. But can you tell me a little bit about helping him navigate through the mess, like your role and how you felt about that process?
Yeah. Well, I have a story in my book that talks about the conversations that we had in detail, not like blatant detail, but pretty detailed. And he started dating, and the conversations that I had with him were really striking, in that I realized that he hadn't heard a word I'd said for 14 years about sex. So
wait, stop there. Like, what do you mean he hadn't heard a word? Like, it didn't resonate, or he just sort of didn't want to listen to it? How did that? Tell me more about that.
I think it's like with my son, it was one of those things where he was like, he'd be listening in on conversations and be like, okay, that's not for me. I'm going to go ahead and not pay attention to that. And he would do this in like different instances. So for example, at the time he started dating, we actually had a person that was coming into the house and giving him one-on-one lessons about sex and sexual preference and sexual identity and what to do and condoms and understanding about consent. So we had somebody in the house actively giving him these lessons. But when he started dating, one of his first questions for me was like, he was 14 and he comes into the room and he says to me, so a girl kissed me. Are you ready to be a grandma? And I was like, what? So because one of the biggest challenges for me, especially with my son, has been not to uproariously laugh when he says something, because when I get uncomfortable, I laugh. When I am sad, sometimes I'll laugh. That laughing is just a reaction for me. And so when he said that, I try to kind of take it down and really think about what he was saying. I didn't react. I said, okay. And then at bedtime, now he's 14, we're still putting him to bed. And so at bedtime, I went in there and, one of the things about having kids with autism is that there's a lot of structure around it. So there's a lot of rituals. So we had a bedtime ritual. And I went in there and I said, just because you have a girlfriend doesn't mean you have to have babies. That's what condoms are for. And he was sitting there, feeling very much like a man, and that's one of the things we don't really discuss that much in our culture, in our society, about how being diagnosed and having ASD or ADHD or your learning disability kind of like really clashes with some of those expectations that are more cultural. And so because we're Latinos, there's an expectation of a certain amount of machismo or a certain amount of understanding who you are as a man. So he's sitting there, with his blanket, and he gets really upset, and he goes, I know. And I said, okay, well, you could always use a condom. And he said, what's a condom? And I was like, oh my God. So that's when I knew that he maybe wasn't paying attention to all of the different conversations we were having. And I, calmed down and I explained again. And then as soon as I had a chance, I contacted the gentleman who was giving him sex education. And I made sure he covered condoms again. And I was checking in, like, what issues are you covering? What are you doing? Because I used to be the sex ed teacher in 5th grade. So I've always believed that there is a certain amount of knowledge, or kids should know all about sex. And so because it's really hard to, so I'm an incest survivor, and it's really hard to protect your kids if they don't understand what sex is and what consent is. And so from an early age, I talked to my kids about this, but apparently one of them wasn't listening. And so that became a really interesting development in our relationship, because this did keep going for about 9 years. Wow. Where I realized that I would tell him something, and as soon as he didn't feel like it was for him, he'd kind of zone out, and he'd be acting like he was paying attention, and I would check in to see if he was paying attention, but he really didn't care. And so he didn't feel it applied to him, so he wasn't going to give it any mind.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So there's so many places I want to go here, but I want to pause for a second on the importance of teaching children about sex, because I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And my 5.5-year-old started asking questions, like actually a few years ago, about like, if a baby's in your belly, like how did it get there? And so it's been my husband's and my philosophy to answer honestly with facts, and not more than she needs to know, right, at any particular time, but like just answer honestly, so that it doesn't make it seem as though you're hiding something shameful. But what do you think? Like, why? Tell me more about that importance.
That measure of figuring out how much to tell them,
so hard,
so that it's not violating, because it can be violating for them if you don't understand how much information they need. So my trick with my kids was always like I'm going to give you an example. One time my son came into the kitchen. My husband was doing the dishes because I hate dishes. And so my husband was doing the dishes, and my son goes in there, and he kind of goes up to him and he goes, "Hey, Dan, have you ever had crabs?" And my husband was like, okay, he's trying to find himself in context, because he's doing dishes and he doesn't really know what is going on. And my son has made no introduction. That was his initial question. And then my husband says, "Do you mean the STD, or do you mean the kind that are in the water that you can eat?" And so those are the kind of questions that we've learned to slow down and ask, and then double check, like, oh, the STD. Oh, no, I haven't had that. Do you have any questions? Or what would you like to know about that? And then instead of giving them this long lecture about what things are and how they apply, and maybe providing more information than the child's ready to digest. But also, one of the interesting things about sexuality and autism, really any learning disability and mental health as well, is how many people don't believe that people that have a disability or a mental health issue have any business having sex. And so one of the things that I had to really advocate and teach the mothers of the girls that he was dating was that there was a sexual need. This was a thing. And the fact that they like I remember one of the moms said to me, why in the world do you think they want to have sex? They haven't even kissed. And I said, hold on a second. I'm checking your information. And then I went up to my son and I said, are you guys like deep kissing, French kissing? And he goes, is that where you kiss each other on each cheek? And I said, no, that is not what it is. I said, that's when you kiss the other person and you use your tongue. He goes, oh yeah, we're totally doing that. But the girl's mom didn't know. And so we had to take it step by step. And then that was one of the things that kind of I asked when he came to me eventually, and he said, I'm ready to have sex. What do I do? And I said, you have to ask the other person. And he goes, well, I know they want sex. I go, no, you have to ask the other person. And then we took it step by step. But you know, it was surprising how many people I heard say things like, he has a learning disability. He has autism. He has this, he has that. He has no business having sex. And so for me, this was a personal journey of learning what it means to, during the entire time when I learned about autism, it's been a journey of understanding humanity on this level that I didn't have, that I thought I didn't have experience with. It turns out my mom probably has autism, but that I thought I didn't understand. And so putting that in context was really interesting, because you do have to fight for your kids' rights. During the time when my son was diagnosed, for example, one of the things that I had to fight for was not having the school put him in an MMR, is mildly mentally retarded class. That's what they called those classrooms. They wanted to put him in a mildly mentally retarded class. And I had to fight that and explain that that's not what autism was. And so that was really challenging as well.
Absolutely. And so tell me a little bit more about your own mother, and and so why you think that, and you said she has?
Yeah. So she's
still with you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things about my mom. My mom had severe mental illness. It was never officially diagnosed that I'm aware of, but she was often asked to be put on, the doctors often asked her to get on medication. She never did. She couldn't stand being on medication. She definitely had a lot of the markers that you see with autism, like, for example, very rigid thinking, needing things a certain way. She kept a very fastidious household. And I'm not saying that I'm generalizing. So this might not be the case for everybody with autism. And it's definitely not the case if you have autism and ADHD. There's like instances of chaos and then instances of orderliness. But she had repetitive behaviors. She had just a lot of, there was a certain innocence or lack of maturity that is difficult to kind of put your finger on and explain. But I definitely think that she had autism, and it was just undiagnosed.
Yeah, that sounds very recognizable to me in some of relationships with family members as well. So I hear what you're saying. Tell me a little bit then, did your mother's undiagnosed autism, do you think, play a hand, or how much has it impacted your relationship with your son as you worked through that diagnosis?
So that's a really great question. So I need to say that I don't speak to my mom anymore. So we parted ways at some point. And part of it was that she wouldn't take care of her mental illness. A large part of it was that she wouldn't care for her mental illness. She wouldn't be in therapy. She wouldn't take medications, and she just would not change her behavior.
Yeah.
And her some of her behaviors were really, and I'm not saying that this was because she had a undiagnosed autism. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the level of mental illness that she had was so out of control that she would do things that were not reasonable. And so, for example, one of the things that she would do was that she would she would get really paranoid. So she would put like cardboard cutouts of people on the windows so people would think someone was home. And so those kind of things are really beyond for me, it was really beyond my comprehension. So the fear was really difficult to see her go through. The paranoia was really difficult. When she would start cycling, she would call me. And so it just became really, really difficult to maintain a relationship with somebody who was unwilling to change. That said, my son lives with her. This is his choice, and I didn't get in the way of his choice. So he does live with her. They seem to be okay together. He's tried living with me a bunch of times. So he was with me into his 20s until he was about 22. And then after that, he's kind of gone back and forth between our households.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry that it's been just so hard, it sounds like, to grow up and to grow into adulthood and then motherhood with somebody who it was very difficult to maintain a relationship with.
And who had no guidance for how to be a parent. So so there's I could talk for hours about my relationship with my mom because it has been a very, very difficult relationship. But she was very good with my kids. So she's really good with little kids. It becomes harder once they have their own identities and their own opinions. And was the same way with us, with my brother and I. And she was, some of the things that I got out of my relationship with her is that she was very ethical and had really strong morals. And so for that reason, it helped guide the way that I behave and the way that what I value. But besides that, my relationship with her has been really difficult. And in terms of how to be a mom or how to be the kind of mom that I wanted to be, I mostly try to do the opposite of what she did. So she wasn't a good source of security because she was so paranoid. And a lot of the times she would do things like, she was scary. So instead of being an object of support, you would go up to her and, for example, I would go up to her and I would say, hey, I talked in class today. I was really shy. I talked in class today. And she's like, oh, aren't you afraid that everybody's going to humiliate you when you speak up? Why would you want to speak up when everybody could listen to you? And so that's kind of the mind space she was in. So my successes weren't successes for her. They were just fraught with fear and worry. So at one point, I became the first woman in my family to go to college. And she stopped speaking to me for 3 months. She didn't like it. She didn't want me doing that. And she didn't know how else to retaliate because I had made up my mind that I was going to do this. And she was really angry. I'm the first woman in the family, actually the first person in my family to graduate from college. That was also problematic for her. And when I went into teaching, because that was my first career, was to be a teacher, she hated it. She tried to get me to quit all the time. And so, you know, I think it's really, really difficult when you have a mother who doesn't have a solid foundation for who she is and how she loves herself. She can't emulate that for you, and she can't love you the way you deserve. And so that's been very, very challenging because I see my daughter now and I'm like, that is one badass girl. And I see some of the things that she does that were similar to some of the things that I was doing. Like she pushes the envelope, she says no to certain things. Right now, she's got this whole my body, my choice thing going on, which is great, but not helpful when I'm asking you to brush your teeth.
Yeah.
So, but that pushback, that need to not follow rules and to be your own thinker, that's me. So I can see it, but instead of reacting with fear and getting upset the way my mom did, I was like, that is one badass chick who is going to know who she is. This is a good thing. And for my mom, the separation between our identities was very difficult.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. How, if at all, did that work its way into your writing?
I write about my mom a lot. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out how much to tell you.
You can tell us as much as you feel comfortable.
Yeah. I grew up in a very abusive household. And it was the kind of household where, after I stopped teaching, I went into research. And one of the things that I studied was systems. How does a school system function? What is it that makes it successful? What kind of roles do people play? How do you treat people to get, systems? Mental health, the same. And so when I look back, I'm able to see my family as a system that perpetuated abuse. And so there were people in the family who were pedophiles and who were supported in being pedophiles. So there was one person in the family who sexually abused a lot of the girls. I really thought, up until I was in my 20s, I really thought that nobody knew. Like I was innocently going through life thinking, oh, the reason that this person was allowed to do this is because no one knew. And when I confronted somebody in the family, their answer wasn't, oh my God, I can't believe that person did that. You're a liar, which is what I expected to get right, because a lot of families are horrified and they push back. What I got was, oh no, you too? And so that was very upsetting, because the women that were hurt by this person, and it wasn't just one person, but by this particular person, had rage issues, really struggled to function as women, and were addicts. And they were really destroyed by what this person did. And nobody in the family ever spoke up. And so I did, but that's a whole other mess. There was an instance where I found out when I was a lot older that he had children living in his household, and I called DCSF. And that was hard because everybody knew that it was me that did it, and I had to put up with some phone calls. But it's like when I go back to this idea of systems, like you can't be an abuser if everybody doesn't accept it. And so I think my mom knew to a certain degree. I don't know to what degree, but I think she knew. And so the only thing that she could think of was to figure out ways to control me so that it wouldn't keep happening. So she would, tell me not to talk. Are you okay?
Oh, please keep going.
Okay.
Anyone who watches the show knows I get teary at various points. So
that's okay.
Just keep going. Just ignore it.
So there were, so she would teach me how to be smaller, how to make myself small, how to not be noticed, how to, and can I just say how funny it is that I'm talking to you about this right now? I obviously did not learn what my mother was trying to teach me. So she tried to teach me to be smaller. She tried to teach me to be quiet. She tried to teach me to not challenge things. She didn't want me educated for lots of different reasons. I understand some of them, but I don't understand all of them. I'm not sure that my dad was not a pedophile, so I can't really say anything about him and the way that he navigated the world. But he was very verbally and emotionally abusive, and he'd hit us too, but it was mostly emotional and verbal abuse. And so so she was playing her part in perpetuating this, even though she probably didn't understand that she was perpetuating it the way that she was. But she did know very early on that this was happening, and she did freak out. And her message was, stay away from those people, which of course made me feel like it was me, that it was my fault, that I had done something wrong. And I'm sure that the other girls that were also abused probably felt the same way. And I have to say, those girls were my cousins, and they were beautiful people, and that was taken away from them.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. Yeah, no, please keep going.
Yeah, I regret that I didn't get to know who they were before all that happened, because it is really difficult to see somebody broken down that way. And I had one of my cousins would always talk about how she just wanted her memory erased so that she could start all over. And I hear that. I get it, right? Not all of us are in a position in our lives to get the therapy we need, to have the education to get through that, and to become the women that we want to be. And so I was really lucky in so many different ways, because I've been married a couple of times, and my first husband was really violent, and I left him. I left him pretty quickly, but then I married somebody else who was even more violent. And so my development as a person, as a woman, has been really, really challenging. But one of the best things that I did was that when I found out I was pregnant with my son, I immediately put myself in therapy. I was like, I am not going to be like my parents. I'm putting myself in therapy. And that kind of launched me in a very different direction than other people. And then also, I'm not afraid to do hard things. So I figured, I have to completely break down what I've got going on to rebuild the person that I was before the abuse. I'm in. And so I don't know a lot of people that can, going back to my cousins, they were living in poverty. They had jobs that were, I'm sure, challenging. Who has time for therapy? One of them had many children. Who has time for therapy? You can't expect it. You have to respect people and women. I always think of it because I was really angry at the beginning when I found out what had happened and that nobody had stopped it. And I confronted them a couple of times, and I said, why didn't you say something? Why can't we say something now? And they both said, no, you are not to talk about it. Do not include us. You are not. And so I said, okay. So years later, I thought, they're trying to get through this trauma in whatever way they can. And I have no business challenging that. Because every woman carries their trauma with the amount of coping skills and with the amount of dignity that they're able to handle. And that is not my journey. That is their journey. And I chose to respect that. But it took me a while.
Understandably so. Yeah. And you are, as Dan Vela here says, is that your husband? I think you mentioned it, Dan.
It
says,
is.
that you are very brave. And I just want to say, I totally agree with him. You are a very courageous, fierce woman. And I'm so sorry that happened to you and your family. Nobody deserves to be abused. But thank you for sharing it with us and for your courage. Yeah. And tell me a little bit more about so I want to go back to the education that you're giving your son and your daughter. And then we'll move away from sex a little bit, although we don't have to. About this issue. And just, you said it's particularly important for children to know about sex so that they can articulate if they're being abused, right? So tell me about your children and the sex education you're providing them.
So my son had a major language delay. He had what I know now is like selective mutism. And so for a really long time, he didn't speak or chose not to speak. He had all of the vocal capacity, right? But it wasn't his mode of preferred conversation or the way that he preferred to communicate with us. That's why I have really difficult time with talking about communication in terms of speaking, because so much of communication happens without a word. And there's so many different ways to communicate and tell people what you need. But he had he was in a language class. So he was receiving language classes through the district where we lived. And one of the women the woman that was his language teacher came to me with a complaint. He was 4. And she said, we need to talk about the dirty language that your son is using in class. And I was like, okay, my son's a rabble-rouser. Didn't know that because he's so quiet. So I said, okay, what's going on? And she said, he said the word penis in my class. And I said, okay. So it's always like whenever there's confrontation or whatever, I always think it's a good idea to slow the conversation down, right? You don't want to react. You don't want to throw insults. You want to really, really slow the conversation down and find out what it is, where it is that people are coming from. And so I said, oh, and that upset you? And she said, yes, he said it in front of everybody in the class. And I said, okay, can you tell me how he said it or what he said that was so upsetting? She said, yes, we were talking about soap and he said, I wash my penis with it. And I looked at her and I said, that was problematic? She said, yes. And I said to her, okay, so this is where I gather information. This is where the advocacy mom comes out. And I said, okay, first of all, you told me my son needed an increase in his language capacity. So we got him a bunch of like books to help him with language. Penis is actually a biological word. You have children. You should know that teaching the biological, I didn't tell her you should know, but I said, it's a good choice to use the correct biological terms with your children. And now I know that like all this leads to less likelihood of abuse and stuff, but that's a whole different conversation. And she said, well, I found it very upsetting. And I said, did the other kids know what he was talking about? She said, no. Nobody knew what a penis was. Oh, no. I was like, okay, so this is a personal issue. Oh, yeah. And I said, so then I had to explain to her, I don't have a problem with that. If you have a problem with it, I'm really, really sorry. But you have kids and you should be using the correct biological terms, yes. Not pee-pee or wee-wee or whatever it is that makes you feel good when they talk about their biology. I'm like, my son is learning the correct words. And so it was just one of those things where I had an opportunity to stand up for him, and I had the opportunity to say something, right? Because I mean, I think it's really important to say that kids that are different in schools tend to really get bullied. Yeah. And it's not just by students. They get very bullied by teachers. Yeah. And it was a very predominant thing that I saw in his education, that a lot of the times the teachers chose to not like him or not find him acceptable, and that modeled behavior for everybody else. And so, and I have to say this as a person who recently left a position in a school that was about 60-70% ASD and ADHD, that was very neurodivergent. And my students were not treated that way. It was all about advocacy. It was all about them trying to find out who they were. It was all about being genuine, because having to hide or mask your ASD or ADHD takes years off your life. We don't want that. And so, but yes, going back to the sexuality, yes, that was a problem for not only, we don't have a system in this country where it's acceptable, I guess, for 4-year-olds to say penis in class.
That is tragic. I think
it is
tragic. Tell me a little, and I agree with you, which is why we teach our daughter to say, the right words for things. And if she knows the word for like fingernail or like earlobe or something, you should teach them the words for the rest of their bodies, especially the parts that you want them to know, to be the most informed and educated about.
For sure. Yes.
So Something interesting that you said in there was that a lot of your interactions with your son and in your household are beyond words or different from words, so gestures. And so tell us a little bit more about the how do we want to put it? Not nonverbal, word specific language, and then how that finds its way into your craft.
Yeah, so it's interesting because so in terms of language, my son and my daughter are opposites. I love that she talks, but sometimes I have to say, okay, no, we're talking now. Because it's a stream of consciousness that can go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so so I have to set boundaries sometimes when I'm really overwhelmed, which she's got on for a while and I'm really overwhelmed. I have to set boundaries. So one of the things that I've learned about people on the spectrum is that they want to connect. They really want to connect. And sometimes they don't have the best tools to do that. So what a lot of people that are on the spectrum or that are ADHD, what we do is we information dump. Right? So you'll be talking to us and we'll be like, well, there's a whole thing about, and we'll go on and on about stats and facts, which is more acceptable and interesting when you're an adult. But me doing that when I was 6 was probably creepy to some people. And so my kids, they'll be in a conversation and my son will say, Sonic the Hedgehog, the first iteration that was done in blah, 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 blah. And I'll be like, the number of pixels that were used for that character are not the same number of pixels. And, then all of a sudden it becomes this long conversation. But for the most part, he's very quiet. And so one of the things that I learned how to do, because he does have autism, is that touching was not okay. And so it's very isolating and very difficult to have a child that doesn't want you to touch them. And so we actually developed language for how to tell each other that we loved each other without there being a lot of hugs or snuggling or a lot of invasion of space. And I mean invasion of space on his part, that maybe he didn't want me to touch him. And so there was, and because he also has a lot of sensory issues, right? So he doesn't necessarily want to be touched. So one of the things that we would do is when he wanted to tell me he loved me, he would reach his pinky out and I would grab him, and this was a hug.
Oh.
And so there was all these different ways that we developed where he could get what he needed without him actually having to verbalize it. Now that he's older, verbalization is more encouraged. But when he was little and he had selective mutism, I begged the school system to allow me to teach him sign language, and they refused.
Really?
Yeah. And now, of course, now we know, information dump time, that if you teach your kids that have autism American Sign Language, that it actually triggers, because it's movement, it triggers something in the brain that could cause spontaneous talking.
Really? I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. So whenever, and I don't remember how I learned this, but so when he was little and he would have school breaks, right, in the summer or in the winter, the teachers always said, we want him in summer school, we want him for winter break school, or whatever it is that they were doing. And for him, being in school was a punishment, right? Because being different and going to a school means that you're going, it's almost like going to your workplace every day, having to do it, but nobody likes you. Yeah. And so he knew nobody liked him. He knew it was problematic. So I didn't make him go to summer school. I would put him in swimming, things that included not only fine motor movement, but gross motor movement. And so that helps organize the brain. And so, and so that's what I would do. And I mean, I think part of it was just intuitive. And I think part of it was just that after a while, I started seeing, oh, wait, if I do this, then this happens. But going back to your question about ways to communicate is, people with autism and stuff, they have movements that they do, or things that they'll show they're upset, where you can tell through body language. You could tell. My son had sounds that he would make so that I knew what was happening. So if, for example, I said, hey, you want burritos for dinner? And he'd go, I knew that wasn't a good sound. He was not going to say, look, burritos, we had those yesterday, and give me a whole thing. But he was definitely making it clear through sounds. And then, of course, there's the what we consider to be more acting out behaviors. He used to run away. And so there's no bigger message than I'm really upset with you than packing your things and leaving. And because I reacted so strongly to him doing this, it perpetuated it. I wish that I had understood differently at the time, but it always made me panic when he would grab his things and decide he was leaving. And, we always found a way to talk about it afterwards that was kind of joking and, in a safe place where he could talk about it, right? But he had a tendency of just getting up and leaving. He did this in school as well. They were always misplacing him. So he was supposed to be in like third period and nobody knew where he was. He was supposed to be in the after school program. He was actually outside. He had escaped the school somehow. And I mean, I think that a really important part of this conversation is, what do you do when your child is not very vocal, has autism, gets frightened easily, and is a minority?
Yeah.
Do you call the police? And my answer would be no. Because we know that the likelihood of a child who is of a certain age, he's a young man, who's a minority and is acting out, that's not going to end well. And I've actually spoken, because I worked as a researcher for such a long time. I've spoken to police about what they're doing about mental health in the city of Los Angeles. And so I know that they're trying, but I'm not going to tell you that they all are well versed in how to de-escalate situations, because I think we've seen that that's not the case.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you do a lot of advocacy work and work on equity. I know, and something that you said even in the line of your bio, that you address the needs of immigrant Mexican families and the disparities they face every day. And I'm just rereading this again because it's so important. Tackle issues of inequity and how ingrained societal systems support the ongoing injustice that contributes to continuing poverty and abuse. So it's rare, I think, at least in my experience, to see like a mission statement in a writer's bio. Why is it so, and this is sort of an obvious question, but why is it so important to you to list the mission statement for your work right there in the way you present yourself?
Because I don't think enough people are doing this work. I mean, I think even if you look at writers, and I think we saw this quite a bit with some of the books that have come out recently. I'm not going to remember the name of the book, but there was a book that came out recently where a woman wrote about the experience of being an immigrant, and she was a white woman. And there was this whole controversy, especially in the Latino community, about how to receive that and how to discuss that and how to not be hurt by that, because these are our stories and we are writing about them, but the publishing industry doesn't want them. And so I think that one of the things that came out of that particular conversation was people saying, well, I'm an artist, I'm not political. And I think that's great for you, but I can't afford to do that.
Yeah.
So a lot of my art, as well as especially during the summer when Black Lives Matter was really big, I was feeling really restless. And my daughter said to me, look, if you're upset about what's going on, draw it. And it really like put a challenge on me to express what I was seeing and what I was feeling through in a visual lens. And I think I did about 5 pieces. They're charcoal and pencil pieces, mostly charcoal, I think, on how I felt about what was happening in the United States and about the kids that were and continue to be in cages and all that. I don't think that I can be, especially because I am a nonfiction writer, I can't be the kind of person that doesn't say, this is what I'm about. Because as a writer, I live in Los Angeles. There's a lot of racism here, even in Los Angeles. And I think that this is one of the cities where most people would be thinking, oh, you're in Los Angeles. There's not a lot of racism there because there's so many Latinos. That's not the case. My husband and I were once walking down our street, and somebody thought we were going to mug them. This is where we live. And somebody thought we were going to mug them and that we were gangsters. There's a lot wrong with that statement, including the fact that I'm way too old to be a gangster. I don't fit, going back to facts and information dumping, I don't fit the demographics, right? Gangsters are not in their almost 50s. They're usually under 30 years of age. And so I also wasn't dressed appropriately to be a gangster, but
I love I have to say, I love the very factual breakdown of why you couldn't be perceived as
I don't know the right gang signs, but this woman thought my husband and I were carrying our groceries up from the car, and she thought we were going to mug her and steal her car. And I was incensed. Like, my husband at the time, I think, was already in his 50s. It just didn't make any sense to me. But, people's fears kind of run the gamut when it comes to people they don't understand, right? Which is why I always push that people need to be genuine and they need to be who they are without hiding it, because it really sets the bar for diversity and having to deal with things that others might be uncomfortable with. For example, my husband and I are different religions. He's Episcopalian, and I'm an atheist. And so you don't show up to a Latino family and tell people you're an atheist, because you will get run out of town. And so somehow he's found it in his heart to look past those prejudices and still love me. And I know that there probably is a lot of people out there thinking, well, yeah, duh. Well, yes, in your culture, maybe it's acceptable, but in my culture, it's not. And so, showing up exactly for who you are, whether you are a quirky person that has ASD and needs to hand flap sometimes because that's your jam, or whether you have nervous tics. And we didn't discuss this, but both ASD and ADHD people have a lot of self-harming behaviors. Sometimes they're very small, like I do this when I get nervous, or sometimes it's skin picking. Sometimes it's other things like always setting yourself up to be late to be somewhere. And so there's those behaviors, and they get more extreme. My mom did the hair pulling. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. And then, there's just, you need to show people who you are so that we can kind of grapple with the fact that we are not all the same. And so, and teach, right? We need to teach each other. So there's a lot of BIPOC people that are like, it's not my job to teach you. And it's true, it's not our job. But you know what? I'll teach you. I'm okay with it. You ask me the dumbest questions you feel you've got, I'm a teacher on the inside. You ask me and I will help you through it, because it's better if somebody breaks it down for you than if you accidentally hurt somebody that is living in the trauma of their race, right? So some of us I have a really good friend, Julian, who runs the Nasiona, and he's a wonderful human being. And we're each in different places in our healing in terms of race. And so he gets triggered by some things and I get triggered by others. And so we can come together and kind of discuss them. But if there's something that I can do to help support him, I'm so there for him. And so for example, one of the things that minorities, Latinos hear very, very frequently is, oh, your English is so good, you're so eloquent. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons for it. And part of the reason that I'm able to be eloquent and that my English is so good is because I purposely hide my Mexican accent. And also I was a lit major, and lots of different reasons. But if you're broken down all the time by being told about, the prejudices against you over and over and over again, it's really difficult to heal from that and be okay. But if I have more capacity than one of my other friends, I want to be there. So if you have a question about race, I'm totally here. And I do teach about race and stuff for workshops and other things. So that's always a really great opportunity to be able to talk to especially young people about why you should be a writer and why you should be visible about your politics.
Yeah. Thank you. That's such a great moment. I would say that's a great moment to end, but I still also want to hear some of your work. So could you maybe read us out tonight? We can listen to a few minutes and then I'll bring you, I'll give you the stage here and then I'll come back up to say goodbye. But let's hear a little of your work.
Okay. This is called On the Bus. And this was my first piece that was published through Hippocampus. It's a piece that I'm very proud of. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. On the bus. In third grade, the bus driver took a special interest in me. I climbed the bus in the morning, hoping that he wouldn't notice me. I crowded onto the bus with the other children on my street. In the mix, I must not have stood out. Or maybe he wasn't a morning person. In the afternoon, I'd climb up the steep bus steps. I'd walk down the aisle looking for an inviting face to sit next to. Then I'd find a seat alone among the cracked green pleather seats. I'd wait for an hour to get home. At my stop, I climbed off the bus. The bus driver threw an arm in front of me to stop me from leaving. Aren't you going to say bye this time? Maybe you can say, have a good evening. I froze. I was 8, but I knew what this meant. He wanted something from me. He wouldn't wait till I offered it. The exit door stood wide open while he barred me from leaving. At the foot of the steps, my mom stood waiting. I didn't want to give him my words. While the bus driver continued to tease me, she never spoke. She never moved. I mumbled, "Good night." "I can't hear you. Say it louder." I become flooded with my own timidity and my Spanish mouth, trying to say those English words. I'd been taught to be polite, but this didn't feel right. It felt like a sick surrendering. I glanced at my mom as she waited, cross-armed and silent. Even from the top of the steps, I could smell her anxiety and fear. I could tell her breaths were coming faster, like little hiccups. She held her small frame tight with her arms, tight, like she had to hold herself up, tight, like her arms corseted her frame into place. I wanted to protect her while she passively cut me like a knife. She never spoke up. Her fear caught in her throat like a scream, staring at me like she was watching an accident happen. "Good night," I said more loudly, bending to give him what he wanted, but I wouldn't make eye contact. "That's good," he said. I could feel him watching me as I reached my mother. She pretended she hadn't seen anything. She took my hand and politely thanked the bus driver. As I walked away, I felt the heaviness of his gaze. With his eyes, he lifted my dress to see the stains on my underwear, and I let him. The bus station was crowded with people carrying luggage and baggages. One woman hauled 2 bulky boxes taped shut and tied down with twine. They were likely treats and candies for the family she was visiting in the United States. I traveled with my mom's sister. My aunt and I had 1 bag each. We were waiting for the bus that would take us from Mexico to the United States. I counted on my aunt to put us on the right bus. I dragged our bus bags into an enclosed part of the station where it seemed safer. I was 16, but she counted on me to keep her secure. In her 50s, she was prone to severe anxiety that racked her like seizures. Wait here, I said. I gathered our bags and found her a place to sit. I was known for being tough, fearless. In the face of the anxieties quaking through the women in my family, the fact that I didn't break into hysterics was a major feat. They had decided I didn't have feelings. I'm going to see if I can spot our bus. Okay, she said. I walked out, thinking she was safer inside, surrounded by a group of people. I pushed my way through to see what buses had arrived. I didn't see our bus. I walked back to check on her. When I returned, a bony man was leaning on her shoulder. His slack mouth and unfocused gaze made him look almost delicate, like a newborn baby surging forth from alcohol's womb. With his eyes waving back and forth across the back of his head, with his eyes waving back and forth between the back of his head and behind his lids, he didn't look prepared to make any decisions to hurt anyone. But Thea stared straight ahead, frozen as fear shook her body. What happened? I asked. I glared at the man. He was drunk and barely lifted his head. His eyes opened and closed, but remained unfocused. Did this asshole do something to you? I asked. He leaned on me and his head slid down my chest, she said. She stifled a sob. I reached into my pocket. I haven't found our bus, I said. I pulled out a pocket knife, a gift from my father's psychopathic mother who had filled my head with ideas of being raped. As I opened the knife, the man slowly lifted his head. If this asshole leans on you again, stab the motherfucker. We'd been speaking in Spanish. The drunk man initially ignored me as he struggled to stay upright, but I stared at him intently as I gestured at him with the knife and handed it to my aunt. He started a steady prayer. No, 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 no. It's a prayer I understood. It's the same prayer I used when my fears overtook me and I was trying to prevent feeling from escaping. He spilled off the chair and staggered away. I went to find our bus. When I returned, Thea was stiffly in the chair, shaking. With unsteady hands, she used the blade to clean underneath her nails. I almost laughed at her timidity, as well as her need to still behave like a well-bred lady. I took the knife from her. I didn't feel the need to be a lady. My father's family had been calling me a whore for a long time, and the words covered me like a crusted shell. Abuse doesn't harden all of us. My aunt's husband had beaten her for 20 years, and it seemed to have made her softer. I stayed by her side the rest of the way home. Her fear drained her. She slept on the ride. I took the bus by the aisle so she wouldn't be afraid. I didn't smile at others. I didn't invite conversation. I stared steadily forward, my eyes unfocused. She would not have used that knife, but I wasn't like her. I couldn't think of a single thing I could possibly lose at this point in my life. So I leaned back on the seat as I tried not to feel anything but the courage of anger. I liked riding in the bus at age 21. The back seat has the benefit of a corner. I could sit there, lean to one side, and fall asleep. The bus was nearly empty. I wrapped my arms around my backpack and pressed my items close to my pregnant belly. I dozed off. I slept for 20 minutes, the distance between my college and the junior college closer to my home. When I opened my eyes, a man was seated next to me. The bus was full, and standing students from the junior college crowded the aisles. It was after 5 p.m. on a weekday. It was the time when both students and employees left jobs and schools for home. There was a biting cold in the bus, but at least it wasn't raining. When it rained, it always felt more crowded, and the stifling smell of sweaty bodies and wet sweaters accosted the senses. The scent always reminded me of wet dogs. I resettled my bulk and closed my eyes again. I was visibly pregnant, but I was scrawny from months of vomiting. I was 20 pounds lighter than I should have been. I wore tights under a beige baby doll dress and brown Mary Janes. My hair was pulled back in a ponytail. I was blatantly aware that I looked like a kid, even though I was 21. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the man next to me had pulled out a switchblade. I looked closer at him. Like me, he appeared haggard and war-torn. Unlike me, he hadn't taken the time to hide it behind a layer of makeup and a girly dress. He caressed the end of the blade with his fingers as he talked to me or to himself or to the bus. Fucking pedophile, fucking looking at little girls. I'm going to gut him if he looks at you again, he said. I didn't respond. I looked at the man he was referring to. He was a kid, maybe 18 or 19 years old. He was tall and large and curved with curved shoulders. His mask took up the entire aisle. The kid looked at me. A lot of men did. It wasn't because I was pretty. My nose was fixed on my face like a large beak. My sour disposition was set in my mouth. But even with my eyes closed, they could see into me. Men could tell I'd been abused. These men weren't aware that this is what drew them to me. They wanted to know how good I was, or how my flavor changed when I was vulnerable with fear or humiliation. The kid wanted to know if my eyes went soft like custard when pain racked my body. He saw me and reveled in the power of his maleness, and he wanted to know me better. I thought, please don't look at me, please don't look at me. He just has to look at you one more time and I'll kill him, the haggard man said. I wanted to tell him that I'm not a kid. I just look like one. The man next to me continued to mutter, and the kid continued to throw sideways glances my way as I tightened with anxiety. Looking down at his knife, I saw simply that, a man with a blade. A knife is a knife. An angry person is an angry person. A protector protects. Sometimes that protection is aimed at you, and sometimes it's not. What was that kid thinking? Couldn't he see the blade? The kid got off the bus before I did. When my bus stop came, I stood unsteadily and navigated my body down the steps and into the sidewalk. The man with the blade rode the bus towards the bus station. I walked home. I was owned by my father before I was owned by my husband. I was property that had passed from my father's care into the hands of my husband. It had been like this for our women for decades. In rural Mexico, women walked with chaperones so they wouldn't be taken. We were a delicate group, fragile like the flowers in a field. We could be trampled. These old ideas reverberated within our systems. When I left the house, my family made it clear that outside was dangerous and that women belonged indoors. And they were partly right. In the world, the danger was public but naked. I had the stark rawness that could and would be witnessed. I was safer outside. Within the home, the abuse was silent and secret, unseen and recognized, hidden. So I took my chances out in public where I didn't have to live with the abuse under the same roof. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing so openly and honestly and bravely. I really appreciate you joining me tonight and just this conversation. I feel like a really important conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful questions.
Absolutely. Stick around after we sign out and so I can say goodbye. But thank you again for joining us.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope that you appreciated the conversation as much as I did. And if it resonated with you, please also consider becoming a patron or patroness of Writer Mother Monster. It is just me, your host, Lara Ehrlich. So any support is much appreciated and goes a long way toward helping me keep this podcast running. So thank you all. And again, until next week, have a great night, and I'll see you next Thursday.